session? Jo Jaekyung tells Kim Dan, just think of it as another aspect of the jinx. Kim Dan is confused and asks, jinx? What are you talking about? Jo Jaekyung explains, see, I have a jinx. Before every match, I need to have a therapy session the night before. After Kim Dan remembers their first conversation about this jinx, he asks for clarification. So this is because of your jinx? Jo Jaekyung says, yes. Once I regain my champion title, we'll part ways. Kim Dan says, I should have known you only wanted me for my body. Kim Dan's expression changes, and Jo Jaekyung panics a bit. Kim Dan says, after all, you initially took me in to use me, paying me 5,000 per night. Jo Jaekyung, confused, stands up and asks, what? Kim Dan continues, you should have been honest from the start. It'd be better for me to sleep with you and earn 10 grand more. So let's do it. Jo Jaekyung is shocked and asks, Kim Dan, what are you talking about? Kim Dan adds, if I repay you with my body, you won't have to stay in this backwoods town a second longer. Kim Dan is already prepared to start the therapy, saying, it was 5,000 a night, right? Just do what you've always done and use me as you please. Jo Jaekyung is stunned by this turn of events. Kim Dan is set for the therapy, and Jo Jaekyung can't resist.
Fine.
You asked for it, so you better not regret it. One might have expected Jo Jaekyung to refuse, but that's not going to happen.
It was a dark and stormy night. The howling wind outside seemed to mirror the tempestuous emotions inside Jo Jaekyung's spacious apartment. Kim Dan had made his way there for reasons that were a mix of obligation and something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Jo Jaekyung stood over Kim Dan, his tall frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now filled with a strange intensity as he looked down at Kim Dan. Kim Dan turned his head away as Jo Jaekyung tried to move closer. There was an air of resistance around him, like a fortress he'd built up to protect himself. You act like I'm forcing you, but this was your idea. So stop giving me that look, Jo Jaekyung said, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence of the room. Kim Dan was determined not to make things easy for Jo Jaekyung. He had his pride, and he wasn't about to let Jo Jaekyung think he could be easily manipulated. Jo Jaekyung leaned in, his lips seeking Kim Dan's, but Kim Dan was quick to turn his head, avoiding the kiss. Don't. We can talk without all this kissing, Kim Dan pleaded. His voice was firm, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed his nervousness. Jo Jaekyung's face twisted in anger. He was used to getting what he wanted, and Kim Dan's resistance was pushing his buttons. You think you can just say no like that? He snapped. Jo Jaekyung reached out and grabbed Kim Dan's hand, his grip strong but not painful. He was set on showing his appreciation in his own forceful way. At first, Kim Dan remained stone-faced, not reacting to Jo Jaekyung's advances. But as Jo Jaekyung's lips finally met his in a passionate kiss, something within Kim Dan started to crumble. His initial resistance melted away and he found himself caught up in the moment, actually enjoying the kiss. Jo Jaekyung pulled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Kim Dan, his eyes searching for something in the other man's face. Kim Dan, coming back to his senses, managed to pull his hand free. You don't need to do all this extra stuff. Just get it over with. You've never really cared about me before, so don't pretend now. I'm not doing this because I want to, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Jo Jaekyung was taken aback by Kim Dan's words, his brows furrowed in confusion and a hint of anger. What do you mean you're not doing this because you want to? What about all those times you got so into our conversations? Paying me back like this was your idea, he retorted. With that, he pushed Kim Dan down onto the couch, pinning him there. Let's see how long you can keep up this act, he challenged. Kim Dan was incredibly stubborn. He pressed his lips together tightly, refusing to respond to Jo Jaekyung's taunts. Jo Jaekyung, undeterred, continued to bait him. You used to love this kind of talk. Why are you being so quiet now? Look at you. Your face is all red. You can't deny that you like it, he said, his eyes fixed on Kim Dan's flushed cheeks. Kim Dan, flustered, reached for a nearby pillow and pressed it over his face. Jo Jaekyung reached out to pull the pillow away, but Kim Dan slapped his hand away. We can talk without seeing each other's faces, he mumbled, squeezing the pillow even tighter. Jo Jae-kyung found the situation both infuriating and oddly amusing. "Damn it, Kim Dan, you've been getting on my nerves since you walked through that door," he said. But deep down, he was secretly drawn to Kim Dan's feisty nature. "Well, let's see if you can resist this," he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. He continued to push Kim Dan's buttons. "You still want to pretend you don't like this? Admit it," Jo Jae-kyung goaded. Kim Dan was growing more and more flustered. Don't do this. Why are you being like this?" he pleaded, his voice on the verge of breaking. "Please, Mr. Jo, stop," he begged. But Jo Jae-kyung was relentless. "I've never done this before. Usually I'm the one being pampered. But look at you, you're practically encouraging me," he said with a smirk. Kim Dan was trembling now. "Please, enough. I can't take it." "Kim Dan, you never stood a chance against me," Jo Jae-kyung said with a hint of arrogance. Finally, Kim Dan, overcome with a mix of emotions, pressed Jo Jae-kyung's head because he started to cry. "What are you doing?" he sobbed, his voice filled with confusion and a tinge of desperation. Jo Jae-kyung, seeing Kim Dan's tears, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "Finally, you're looking at me, so you liked it, huh?" he asked mockingly. Kim Dan sniffled. "That was just a natural physiological response." "It doesn't mean anything," he said defensively. Jo Jae-kyung seemed disappointed by Kim Dan's answer. "If you keep being so stubborn, it's only going to fuel my fire," he warned. He continued, "If you continue being this way, I'll have to do something more daring. But don't push it because you're starting to make me mad." Jo Jae-kyung's tone was firm, but there was a hint of uncertainty beneath it. Kim Dan bit his lips so hard that they started to bleed. Jo Jae-kyung watched him, his own emotions in turmoil. "If anyone else took this attitude with me, I would have kicked them out a long time ago," he said. "But with you, Kim Dan, it's different." Jo Jae-kyung admitted, "I just want to be with you and make you cry. I can't hold back anymore because you're not talking to me." He reached out to hug Kim Dan. At first, Kim Dan stiffened, trying to resist. But then, as if something inside him gave way, he finally hugged Jo Jae-kyung back. Jo Jae-kyung was surprised by Kim Dan's response. He held Kim Dan tightly, feeling a rush of emotions he couldn't quite name. Look at his face. He's trying so hard to control himself, but nothing is working, Jo Jae-kyung thought. I almost bust my load as soon as I hug him. It's probably because I haven't seen any action in a while. As they held each other, the room was filled with a tense silence. Jo Jae-kyung could feel Kim Dan's heartbeat against his chest, and it was a strangely comforting feeling. He realized that he didn't want to let go of Kim Dan, not now, not ever. Kim Dan, on the other hand, was still trying to process everything that had happened. He didn't know what to make of his own feelings. Was he just caught up in the moment? Or was there something more between him and Jo Jae-kyung?